would you start off by introducing yourself? You're Pastor Tim Potter, Grace Church, Mentor, Ohio. Would you tell us a bit about you and about your family?
Sure. So I grew up here in Northeast Ohio. I'm actually pastoring the church that I grew up in. Grace has been in existence since 1948 and was a church plant of another church on the east side of Cleveland here. We had 5 pastors before 1972. And my father was actually the pastor from 72 to 2006. I was underneath his leadership as associate and youth pastor for 15 years before I became the pastor in 2006. And I've been the pastor since then. So we're in our 31st year of ministry here at Grace. And I was 5 years a part-time employee before I became a full-time employee in 1991. So about 35 years, we've been ministering here. And we have 4 kids. Ron and I have been married for 30 years. And then we have 4 children, 25, 23, 21, and 19, I think. 2 of our boys are married, and Caleb and his wife, Abby, are in our church, functioning as faithful disciple makers. And they got married last summer. Micah and Elle got married, and Mike is exploring a professional basketball career right now, and they're doing great. And Noah's in college and Emma's in college, and Noah's a junior, Emma's a freshman, and they're enjoying their experiences in their craft, what they're doing. So we're empty nesters for the first time, so we're getting used to that, but it's good. And the Lord's just done some really cool things at Grace in relationship to helping us learn what a first century kind of church environment existence is as we see it in the Bible. And God the Spirit seems to keep using that to help us not just plant churches, but support church plants, and to help. He's just grown that to be able to help churches that are established churches learn what church planting is and how they can partner with it. And it's just been a so on and a so on kind of thing. But what we're doing, we enjoy because it's local church based. It's not necessarily a parachurch organization that is championing the efforts. Certainly, we have no issues working with parachurch organizations, and we do. But God's just allowed us to be able to do this out of grace, which is really encouraging for our people. And the more churches we can, partner with to be able to do what local churches in the New Testament do, the better. So we can talk more about that as we go on, I think. So that's a little bit of a 50,000 foot view of the history here. And hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's good. What you guys have really at Grace Church, you guys have been cultivating a disciple making culture. Can you speak a little bit to that? What maybe a little bit of the struggles in the beginning, what that looks like now, how long it's been going on?
Well, it's been a little bit over 20 years, and kind of like the church planting, efforts kind of go hand in hand with that first century function of the church in disciple making. So how can I Cliff's Notes about 20, 25 years? I can say that we were exploring church planting before we were exploring disciple making. And along the way of exploring church planting, and we did plant. We planted a handful of churches. After our first plant or two, we started to understand that church planting can be done in a way that's not organic as it should be. So what I'm saying is we were taught by, we always had a desire to plant, but we were taught by parachurch organizations what planting was and how to do that. And all that information was fine and it was good. And we did it. But then we planted churches that were not disciple-making churches. And each plant that we planted, we started to watch them struggle commensurately with what they did not know about being spiritually reproductive, like the first century church was. So we realized that we planted them with our DNA because we weren't spiritually reproductive like the first century church was either. And so that's really when we started. After the first two plants, we really started to dig in and say, hey, we have more of an institutional church rather than a first century spiritually reproductive church, because that's all we knew. All we knew was kind of like institutionalism, like how would the schools teach us to do this, and how would the mission boards teach us to do this? And like I said, it was all good. It wasn't bad, but we just really started to dig in. What does thus saith the Lord about how the church is to function, and how churches plant reproductive churches, not just people planting churches or institutions planting churches. So after our first two plants, we really started to dive into figuring out what, the disciple making culture is in the New Testament, and how could we begin to live that ourselves as pastors and then model that for our people. So in time, they would understand the joy of what Matthew 28, 19, and 20 is personally, not just as a church as a whole, but each individual person enjoying, Christ's last words being their first command in living their purpose on this earth. And 20 years later, 20 some ish years later, we still have a long way to go in learning what that is. But we realize that planting is more effectively done out of a disciple making culture rather than an institutionalized culture, because it's self-perpetuating. Sure. Jesus said, I'll build my church and the gates of hell won't prevail against that. Well, there was a how. And the first century church knew that how, and it was through people owning, Christ's last words being their first command. It's harder, it's slower, sure, but it's more self-perpetuating. It's more sustainable, generation to generation. So, that reality here now at Grace has just allowed us to encourage other churches in that as well. We're not the model, we're just a model. If we could just be a source of encouragement to help people understand what we understood over the last 2 or 3 decades, maybe we could just save them some time, save them some agony. And then once they understand that supernatural but natural organic reproduction, as we've connected with them over disciple making matters, God allowed us to now connect with them over church planting matters. It's like out of this organic reality, church planting just happens, and it doesn't happen just by one church doing it or being known for the church planting church. You look at the New Testament, and there certainly was an interdependent function of multiple churches, not only planting, but also helping other like-minded churches do the Great Commission work together. So 20, 30 years, that's kind of what we were. It's kind of what we learned what to be. We got a long way to go, but it started inside, and then I guess we don't promote what we do much. It just kind of leaked out, and there was interest, and then that interest built more interest. And so we've just been able to help a lot of churches now, and then been able to connect all those churches through unto more efficient, maybe God willing, church planting practices. So the churches that we're going to be planting together automatically have more of a first century feel to them than just an institutional, kind of here's a body, let's work the phones, call 50,000 homes in the area, let's get a building, let's get a pastor, let's get a grand opening kind of service. And there's a lot of different ways people planted churches over the last couple decades, but it's just a little bit more organic than that. And then it's many hands make light work. It's not just, like I said, one church doing it. It's how can many be aware of this one church that needs to be planted out of this one church? And how can we come alongside to do that more efficiently? So probably a little bit of a drink from the fire hose, but I hope that's what you were asking.
No, that's good. As you guys have been cultivating that disciple making culture within your church, so you have the church planning side of it, is ultimately the church itself is spiritually reproductive, which is a beautiful thing in reproducing other like-minded churches. Have you seen the health of your church? Can you gauge that at all? The health of your church change as more people have embraced that disciple making mindset, that engaging one another, discipling one another, and have you seen something with that?
Yeah, it's seen a lot with that. I would say what we see is more people coming to know Christ as their Savior through our own people, being the tip of the spear of Matthew 28, 19, and 20 among lost people in our own town.
Okay.
And what we found too, and I want to say this with as much grace as I possibly can, we found that it's much easier to disciple first generation believers into disciple making than it is to disciple second, third, fourth generation Christians into it. And I don't say that as a criticism against them because they're in my church, but it takes longer for them to adopt it because they learn to grow the church in certain ways.
Sure.
And those ways weren't bad ways. They just weren't multi-generational self-perpetuating ways. So they were taught to build the church in a lot of different ways that we discuss in a seminar that we do. But I would say that the spiritual reproductive first century mindset has, over the last 20 years, brought a lot of first generation believers into our church that actually become the models for those that have been saved 10, 15, 20 times longer than they have. And we have it. It's just interesting to see,
Sure.
So shepherding that, I would say, has been a glorious agony in the sense that it's great to watch the flock grow spiritually along those lines. And it's great to watch those that are second, third, fourth generation that never understood this reality for themselves. They just enjoyed it more institutionally as a church rather than personally. It's great to watch them just kind of fall in behind the first generation believers who are really excited about what God's doing in their life, and for them to own that same excitement. So they were excited, for a lot of reasons that weren't bad. Like I've done this, and this in the church, and I've done it for decades, and praise God for the opportunity to do that. But it was good, but it wasn't the tip of the spear of the Great Commission. It wasn't me being out there. So for them, the church was a saving agency, and these first generation believers coming in understand that the church is a sending agency. They want to come and be prepared to go out. And the other wonderful believers in our midst that aren't first generation believers like myself It's a harder thing to learn, but it's a glorious thing to learn. And so, yeah, I would say that that's probably, you know, a wonderful thing about that is just watching the flock adapt. But the blood, sweat, and tears for you as a pastor and for our people who are second, third, and fourth generation is maintaining the unity that the Spirit of God gives us, as we all learn it together. So you really, no soul should be expendable because we get to do God's will. And sometimes we as pastors go into things a little bit faster than we should. So it's just for me monitoring the balance and the pace of a bunch of really good people is super critical. But it's been good. It's been good. And I would say that if the pace is handled wisely, I think we see that even coming into a time of a global pandemic where there's been, you know, a shutdown to a slowdown to a gradual repick up to who knows if we'll ever get back to the pace we did before. I think you guys know this in your area probably better than anyone else. I would say we have zero regrets of investigating what this first century spiritual reproductive reality was before COVID, because when COVID hit, I don't know that it hit us like a bus, a head-on collision, because our people just generally knew what to continue to do because they had been doing it. So doing church at our building with our programs and all this kind of stuff, that wasn't essential to their existence. They still had a mission because they owned it, and we kept learning from each other. And so the easy thing for us to do now is to continue to be disciple makers. And the harder thing for us is to get back to doing what we were doing before. And I'm not so sure I have a problem with that.
Sure.
But anyways, that's another discussion for another time together. But the purpose for this, you know, is just to, you know, thank your people for allowing us the opportunity to be of an encouragement to you folks in other places, and to give you a little bit of a history of how we got to that point. And whatever culture that God's building, I hope it's biblical. I hope we can encourage other places to do it. So I hope we can continue to plant thousands of churches in our lifetime with more of a first century mindset than a good but not self-perpetuating institutional mindset, so to speak. Hope I said that okay.
No, that's good. I think it gives a good background as to where I get that kind of leads into the next question. You know, that shows the foundation of where Arch really kind of came from. I mean, that mindset, you know, and what you guys are seeking to do now with Arch Ministries. So could you then speak to the origin of Arch and the goal, the heartbeat behind that?
Just real quick, we had a guy at our church. He goes, "Pastor, I hear what you're saying. I hear what we're messaging, and I'd like to get behind it." He goes, "Do you think you could get one guy in every state? Do you know of at least one like-minded guy in every state that I could help pay to get together to talk about what this first century mindset is? And so how churches can interdependently do it together?" And I said, "Yeah, I think we could." So that was the first year we ever met, after we had 8 years of a national church planning conference at Grace in Mentor.
Okay.
So we took a few years off to recalibrate and to continue to learn this. Then this guy comes along, and we had that first meeting, and we got 51 guys to come. And that was the beginning of what's now become a National Pastors Fellowship. And in that time period, Arch didn't even exist yet. We hadn't even had a name to it. This was just one local church trying to figure out what this first century interdependence looked like under gospel purposes. So after, I don't know, the second year we had it in Florida, my wife's likes to read anything and everything. So we're driving in a family vacation. She's got a stack of magazines, periodicals, newspapers, and she comes across this article, and the article is about Leonardo da Vinci and engineering, or I don't know. But she says, I just read an article about Leonardo da Vinci, and she goes, this is what you're trying to do. This is what God's laid on our hearts to do at Grace. I said, okay, shoot. And she said, Leonardo da Vinci's definition of an arch is two independent points that are strengthened when they come together.
Right.
And I thought, wow, theologically, philosophically, that puts a lot of practical, kind of a mindset, a metaphor or an illustration of what exactly the New Testament church is. They're independent points that are strengthened when they come together to do what? To go forward in gospel work. And all of our study of all the New Testament churches, that's what they did. Mm. Yeah. And that was Paul's burden for those churches. And not only for gospel progress, but also for interdependent mutual help and encouragement. That's all 2 Corinthians 8-9, right? That's all the churches that Paul works with there with Titus and those men named and unnamed, of gathering the offering for Jerusalem that's in a time of famine, persecution. You know, the mother church is now ministered to by all the daughter churches. And unto what end? Unto, more stable gospel progress. So we just named it Arch. We weren't even a formal 501c3 at that point. It was like, we don't need to be a formal 501c3. We just need to do God's will, God's way as best we can. And we don't need to be the leader of it. We just want to be a model that others can learn from. So off of that, we just came up with 5, we feel, biblical goals that the New Testament church should pursue. And that's what we do for us. So we see in the New Testament local churches wanting to find like-minded people that they can do gospel progress with. We find churches in the New Testament giving to those people that they find. New Testament local churches strengthen one another. That's, all 3 of these are really in the book of 1 Thessalonians, among other places. So we want to find them, give to them, strengthen, and then we see them partnering with each other. We see them planting together. And so that's kind of like a 5-legged table of what Arch Ministries is. We're connecting independent together to become strong interdependently. And then it just kind of kept perpetuating itself. So it's not just Grace doing this. I think if other churches believe it's a biblical thing to do, then they can do it on their own. It's none of our business, right? We're just trying to model, and we just want to keep finding, giving, strengthening, partnering, and planting. Whether people come along or not, that's their business. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's like I said, we don't do deputation. We don't go out and sell this, or, it should be self-promotional if it's biblical. I shouldn't have to do anything to an ask. We'll just be, and if God's in it, then he'll do it. You know what I mean? Oh yeah. And I don't want to sound very unprofessional when I say that, but I don't want it to become something if it's not God's framework, if God's not in it. Yeah. Because I could build something. I could raise a ton of money, and we could together, but unto what purpose? You know what I mean? Yeah. So that's kind of how it formed. Okay. And it's got a little over 2,000 local church contacts that we're all learning together what it means to function interdependently for gospel progress. And it's leaked over north of the border and south of the border, and now it's leaking over overseas. And so if you get on our website, which you guys probably already have, and you just look at our goals, on the landing page of our website, those are national goals, but now it seems like the Lord didn't want us to fulfill all those before it leaked out other places. And the more we just do it, the more interest there is, because I still pastor Grace Church of Mentor. Everyone knows how long it takes to pastor, how many hours a week it takes to pastor. I don't have time to go pastor other people's churches, you know, and I haven't had to take the time to do that. Our people together, if we can be a help, then we'll be a help. But God just keeps doing this. And where is it going? How big is it going? I don't know, because I really don't think much about it. We just keep doing and praying and serving. And I do know this, our people's hearts now is the more they want to become more aware now. They want to find more. They want to give to more. They want to encourage more and strengthen and partner and plant more and more and more. Wow. So there's lots of different ways we do that at Grace, but that's really what Arch is. And that's what Arch is being able to do, not just in planting, but also encouraging the pastors and local churches. And someday when I transition out of Grace, then that may be what the Lord has me do full time. We're still forming that, but I hope that answered your question.
Oh, that's great. You really speak to your heart for obviously your own ministry, but your heart for seeing the gospel advance through planning churches, encouraging others to be disciple-making churches, and just excited to see what God's doing. So I just really appreciate that.
In our neck of the woods, we grew up, Amish country is not far away from here. My dad grew up in Middlefield, Ohio, which is really the buckle of Amish country in Northeast Ohio. I know it goes all the way down into mid-Ohio and so forth, but for up here, Middlefield was it. And one of the things my dad did when I was a boy, he always thought that an Amish barn raising was kind of a fascinating thing. And indeed it is. He took me out to see one. And it was just, indelibly printed on my mind, the function of that. The whole community comes together for one family, and everyone's has a purpose. From the ladies cooking the final meal for the day, to the little tiny grandson, to the bearded grandfather, and everyone in between. They all got busy and they raised that barn in one day and the big feast afterwards. And there wasn't anyone in that, from the little 5-year-old grandson with the toy tool belt to the guy organizing the whole thing. Everyone had a purpose. And my dad always taught, he said, Tim, always remember, many hands make light work. And to me, when you look at a New Testament framework, that really is what was happening. Every New Testament local church was small. I mean, history tells us even Colossae at its peak probably had 25 members. Wow. So the biggest church in the first century is probably Ephesus. And most historians, and I've read, someone can certainly correct me if they have more information, was Ephesus. And it was at its peak probably 250 people. So most churches in our country feel like they're incredibly insignificant if they're running 25. Sure. And the pastor's bivocational, and we're not that church. But to me, the value certainly, and I think everyone knows, is not in the size. It's in the desire to function like a New Testament local church did. Yeah. We were taught autonomy and independence. And I think theologically, philosophically, I get that, but practically, our practice has to touch our theology and our philosophy in very, very understandable, practical ways of interdependence. All of these small churches work together to do a gospel work.
Sure, absolutely.
And I think all kinds of things mess that up in church history, but that's not our discussion today. We're just We're just seeking to move forward to do more efficient, effective gospel work, regardless of size, regardless of said influence, just together with sweet, spirit-filled people that just want to reach the world for Christ. So however that looks in the future.
Good. I appreciate, you know, I think what you shared. It's just really helpful in us getting to better understand, you know, your heartbeat, you know, your heart for ministry, heart for churches and pastors, and ultimately Arch's ministry in that regard as well. So really appreciate it, brother.
You're welcome. Look forward to getting up and meeting all your people.
Yeah.
I've met some of them. Hello to you guys. And can't wait to be up in that neck of the woods, God willing, sometime later this year. And y'all are welcome to come here and see us, and come to Florida and see others. And just prayerfully do what we can together in the future. So thanks for your time.